Hello, everyone. Welcome to FCNL and our Quaker Welcome Center. We're so excited to have everyone here in person and via live stream on Zoom. So hello, everyone. Tuning in, thank you so much. Before we get started, I would love for us to just take a minute of silence. Great. Thank you, friends. So my name is Emily Wirzba, and I lead FCNL's program on sustainable energy and the environment, along with Milo Keller in the audience. Hi, Milo. And so for the past 6 years, we have been seeking bipartisan space for dialogue and action on climate change in Congress. And so I want to speak for just a minute about how that work is grounded in our Quaker values and then turn it over to our fabulous panelists. So we have this belief that there is that of God or the light in every single legislator in Congress, which can be challenging to accept sometimes, but our goals are to seek that common ground and shared values with every legislator because we believe federal action on climate change is critical to addressing the problem that we're facing internationally. So we've sought to find that light of God, that common ground with legislators to create space to actually legislate in meaningful and ambitious ways. And so I think when we think about our work, trying to create a world for our children and grandchildren, our moral obligation to future generations, that is deeply connected with our faith values. And so for me, the act of lobbying and that attempt to find common ground is deeply spiritual. And so it's been fun for me to reflect a little bit on tonight's theme, thinking about how others in this space are inspired in their climate activism by their own Quaker values. So I also want to just say that I know that we're in an interesting political moment where we're seeing a surge of climate activism and climate change in the media. We're seeing kind of way more impacts of the actual climate change effects, and so that we're seeing communities being harmed kind of more and more. And so I think climate change is definitely in the national spotlight right now. And so while there's a lot of things to be concerned about, still I think I'm really hopeful in this moment, and so I'm excited to kind of hear from everyone about the work that they're doing and how they also find hope. So I would like to introduce our speakers, and then we can get started with some questions. And after they've reflected on a few questions that we've prepared, we'll turn it over to questions to those in the audience and those that are tuning in live stream. So I'm going to start with Kallan. Kallan Benson is a 15-year-old activist, lobbyist, artist, and environmental steward. She is a young friend from Annapolis Friends Meeting, whose Quaker roots taught her the value of silence. Kallan just finished a strike without speaking for 90 days until her leaders in the Maryland General Assembly passed the Green Amendment and possibly more, which I'm sure she'll tell us about. So you can read all about her journey in climate activism at QuakerEarthcare.org. Next, we have Jaime Demarco, who coordinates and assists efforts across the United States to advocate for carbon pricing legislation with the Citizens Climate Lobby. And so while CCL remains laser focused on passing a national carbon fee and dividend legislation, there's also growing grassroots energy towards state level carbon pricing policies. So Jaime is dedicated to passing state level legislation that will serve as a model and inspiration for national lawmakers. So before CCL, Jaime also worked on the Maryland Clean Energy's Job campaign, trying to pass legislation in Maryland that would expand the renewable energy electricity to the state, which just passed this week. Very exciting. I'm sure we'll also hear more about that. And as a Quaker, Jaime has also worked here at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And third, joining us via live stream, Beverly Ward. Hi, Beverly. Beverly is the field secretary for Quaker Earthcare Witness. She's also a member of and past clerk of Tampa Monthly Meeting, and she's a member of the SEYM Earthcare Committee. So her history among friends goes back to her attendance at a Quaker high school, and her interest and concern for our natural world occurred with her studies there in environmental science. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring struck a chord with her. She is very well-rounded academically with a PhD in applied anthropology and a minor in public administration. She also earned a master's in public administration and a Bachelor of Arts degree, along with psychology and film and drama. So very well-rounded. So we have a fabulous panel here tonight. I'm so excited to hear from everyone. So the first question that I would like to pose to our panelists, how does your Quaker faith support and inspire your work on climate change and stewardship? And we don't have a particular order, so I will just let whoever feels led to speak first begin.
I think I'll start, if I may. I have a minor correction, but I would, and this leads directly into responding to the question. I'm the field secretary for a Southeastern Yearly Meeting. Quaker Earthcare Witness uses me as their field secretary also, but and it really grew out of the youth of Southeastern Yearly Meeting, the creation of this position. And so I have this fantastic yearly meeting that is supporting the work that I'm doing. And it's work that I love, but in addition to that, I have an anchoring committee. I have dear friends throughout the yearly meeting. And we just lost one of my trusted friends, Barbara Wolf from Tampa Monthly Meeting, who all have this, who understand the urgency and are supporting me in this work.
All right. There are always technical difficulties. All right. Well, I mean, I just got off a 90-day silence strike, and the idea of silence certainly came from Quakerism, and I'm familiar with silence. I know what it's like to be quiet and sitting there reflecting within. But there's also, I remember my kind of first foray into activism in general, and especially climate activism, was the First Peoples Climate March in 2014. And we went to that march with a group of Quakers spanning from my brother and I, who were 8 and 9, and to a 90-year-old who was going through the march route with a walker. So Quakerism has always been uplifting my activism and helping my activism through my Quaker meeting is very supportive. A bunch of them came out on the last day of the session to eat ice cream with us. And so,
yeah. And I think this is a great question. And I was saying earlier that when Emily sent us this question of how does your Quaker faith intersect with your climate stewardship, I sort of realized like it's something I've just sort of taken for granted and hadn't really like sat down and thought about the connection. I think, well, my first thought is that if anyone fully grasps and intuitively understands what's at stake, you're gonna feel compelled to act on climate. If the stakes are what we do over the next few decades could trigger an irreversible runaway effect that will, in the long term, cause the oceans to boil and end life on Earth. But what I just told you is not good messaging. Like anyone who knows anything about climate messaging will say, don't say that. And we're not supposed to say that because it turns people off to hear that. And it turns people off to hear that because it's a hard truth. And people going about their day are not accustomed to suddenly receiving, sitting with, and internalizing hard truths. And I think it is my Quaker practice of sitting and listening and waiting for a message, even when it's a hard truth, to internalize, that has allowed me to sort of fully grasp, to sort of accept within myself how dire the stakes are. And I think a lot of Quakers are drawn to act on climate because we, through our practice, are receptive to the truth when it's told to us, even when it's hard.
Thank you all for that. So my next question is if each of you could spend a few minutes describing a particular solution that you're advocating for, or maybe a project that you've been working on, and tell us kind of in detail what that's been like, what that process has been, and how it gives you hope. And again, whoever would like to start first can.
All right. Oh, okay. We're gonna have, it's gonna take a couple of times. I work on a couple of projects. My main one is Parachutes for the Planet, and that's a global art project where we uplift youth voices around the world by having them express themselves on a parachute, which can be anything. We have ones made out of bed sheets and ones made out of more synthetic, well, an actual synthetic plate parachute. And they're really beautiful, and they allow you, when you look at them, you see the messages of youth from around the world, not expressed in words, but expressed in the paint or the marker or whatever materials they've decided to put on. I've also started doing a lot of Fridays for Future work, which is a global movement started by a teenager in Sweden who's 16 years old. Her name is Greta Thunberg. And she started striking. First, she struck every day before the Swedish elections, and then she struck every Friday after that. And I started during COP24, and that led into the Maryland General Assembly, where I decided to sit outside every day and not speak, and it's been, they give me hope. I'm working with other youth, and I'm learning that there are youth out there who are saying, yeah, this is a problem because it's our future that's going to be affected. We're going to be losing the world that we've grown up in.
A follow-up question. Can you tell us a little bit just about maybe the last week or two and what that work was like in the lead up to recent events?
It's been interesting. I think I haven't quite understood the full scope of things. I mean, I just started speaking again, which is so we're still processing the last 90 days, but one thing that I really learned was when my voice really needed to be in the conversation. Those were the times when it started getting frustrating as you're sitting there and you're like, oh, something is not being said that needs to be said and I need to say it now. But I can't, which gets a little aggravating. It really, and it lets you listen more when you're just not speaking at all. You're actually really paying attention to who is speaking and who is talking to you.
And then, of course, the Maryland Clean Energy Jobs Act passed.
Yeah, that was pretty exciting. A friend friend of mine came for a couple of hours the last day, and we managed to get into the gallery of the house as they were passing it, and it was pretty incredible. I know you've been working on it for a long time, and I've been working on it probably since last session a little, and it was really exciting to see that pass. Yeah.
And for those that don't know, maybe one of you could just do a really brief summary of, I don't know, Jamie, if you were planning on talking about that, or if one of you can do a really quick update for the folks online about what this bill does.
Yeah, so the Maryland Clean Energy Jobs Act is a beautiful, beautiful bill. It radically expands renewable energy in Maryland. It has taken Maryland 15 years to get from 0 solar to 1.9% in-state solar generation. Under this law, we're going to go from 1.9% to 5.5% in 9 months. So we're taking 15 years of progress and nearly tripling it in under a year. That is the kind of radical uplifting of renewable energy that we're going to need to face the climate crisis. It's also the first clean energy bill in the country that specifically funds clean energy businesses owned by women and people of color, and also funds clean energy job training programs that are not just targeted at a general audience, but specifically targeted at communities that have experienced historical barriers to employment. So this is a groundbreaking bill in a lot of ways, and it's one that I've worked on for more than 2 years. I was working on this bill full time for a long time, and it definitely gives me hope to see it pass. It wasn't easy to get it passed, but we did pass it. And then I also have to talk, of course, about the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is a bill introduced into Congress. This is legislation that will reduce US greenhouse gas emissions 40% in 12 years. It'll give more money to people who need it most. And the most incredible part about this bill is that it has bipartisan support. It has Republican and Democratic support in Congress, and it reduces emissions 40% in 12 years. That's not quite the 45% by 2030 that the IPCC calls for, but it gets us a lot of the way there. It's a huge portion of it. And for a long time, we didn't know if Republicans would ever put their name on this bill. And I know Emily has been working for years and years and years to get Republicans to talk about solutions to climate change. And now here we are, living in a bipartisan climate solution world. And it's a brave new world. Who knows where we'll be a year from
Well,
now?
sort of flowing from the work of the yearly meeting, I'm also charged to work with other organizations within the state of Florida and beyond, as I mentioned. And one of the things I'm working on that covers all of that is water issues. Florida is sinking. We also have sea level rise. We also are losing our natural water, and then periodically climatic events give us too much water. So I'm working with a lot of what I call waterline communities. Those communities, particularly low income and minority communities that are on the front line of these water issues. And that has led to some work with Quaker Earthcare Witness through the UN Working Group to convening some side events during the high-level political forum on sustainable development. For the last 2 years, we've convened a side event to coincide with the UN Decade for People of African Descent. And that has, it's both local, global, and with some of the other work with the UN Working Group, we're also bringing in indigenous people. And so we're trying to create awareness of how the impacts of climate degradation are affecting communities globally, and theorizing up from the local level to making these global linkages about what's going on. And so that that's keeping me busy for a bit, but it does all fit together, and it's quite it's quite, it's part of the overall work that I do is taking these local issues and presenting them to on a global forum, and having people make these connections around what's happening in Tampa on the west coast of Florida. There are comparisons to be made in Kilifi, Kenya, and that's really important to both communities.
Great, thank you all. So another question that I have is a little bit trickier. I'm curious what critiques or challenges that you faced while doing your work, and then kind of as you're sitting with those challenges or critiques, how do you have conversations with people that disagree with you? Whether it's about the issue existing, whether it's about your tactics, whether it's about your timelines or your work. I'm just curious to hear that.
Yeah, this is a hard question, and when thinking about how I was going to answer this question, there's a lot you have to like. There's messy things that you can bring up. You can try to give a clean answer, or you can try to give a more sort of like, here's what's going on answer. And I think it's hard to get into politics. And my first instinct is to say that the moment you choose to enter politics, you are committing to compromise your values. But I don't think that's quite right. I think it's more like the moment you enter politics, you are like committing to like compete your values or something. Because there's good people who care about a lot of things disagree with each other. And it comes, and there's a lot of situations, every day we're in a situation of not having an easy answer, especially on climate change, where there is a clear scientifically mandated path that we need to follow. And deviating from that path is to deviate from what science demands. At the same time, politics has its own demands. And to advocate for anything less than what science demands is difficult and causes people to disagree about the degree to which you should accept compromise when physics is uncompromising, and the degree to which you should hope for people to come around when we only have a certain number of years when people can come around. And I think that when talking with people who disagree with you, it's important to understand that to get a group of people together strong enough and diverse enough to pass national legislation, which is what we need, you're going to have to be linking arms with people who you disagree with on a lot of important issues. You can sort of, you as an individual can spout your beliefs about whatever you want and be uncompromised in saying what you want to say. But if you want to get the will of a majority behind you, you have to start incorporating other people's beliefs into what you are putting forward. And unless you're going to embark on the task of changing the mind of a nation, which is a huge endeavor and will probably take more than 12 years, you are going to have to exist with the mind of the nation that we have where it is. And you can either say everything as it should be and accept that you will not have the power to pass what needs to pass, or you can spout something that is not in line with all of your values, but is echoed by enough people that it provides the power that you need. And I think walking the line between those things, I don't mean to say that one is better than the other, but I do think that finding the right balance of the two in where your integrity is and which of your values is going to win out each day and in each decision is a hard challenge for which there is no right answer. And yeah, I just think politics is like all the hardest decisions in life come to the lawmakers. If something is easy, it's figured out and doesn't have to sort of be debated. But if all of the fundamental disagreements of society, like this is the arena. There's no other, people can be in their own social media bubbles and go about their lives, but there are incompatible visions of the future that are being put forward, and the place where they are hashed out and brought into unity or failed to brought into unity is in the legislature. And that's a vicious, ugly process that when you choose to participate in, you're not going to come out with clean hands, even if you come out with the outcome you want.
Okay. I find it interesting that you associate that with just politics. Because I certainly see a lot of that in the climate movement as well. You run into people who just are not, you have one solution and that this is what will solve the climate crisis, and you're not willing to bend. But then you have another person who has this solution. But the difference is that those two people, instead of having to form a compromise and having to get somewhere, can just splinter off and start their own organizations. So, I mean, those are my thoughts hearing you, but as far as talking to people who disagree with you, there's not a whole lot of outright deniers. You still have people who are going to disagree with you, and you still have people who maybe think that climate change exists, but it's not caused by humans, but there's not a whole lot of outright deniers. And I find when you come to the youth climate movement and you come to the kind of denier side, they don't intersect very much. So I run into very few. In fact, it was very interesting being at the legislature because absolutely no one came up to me and said, "You are wrong. You are wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong." I actually had one person who came up to me and said, "You know, we're on absolutely opposite sides of this issue, but I really respect how you're going about this. There are so many hissy fights when people are throwing names back and forth, but you are here just sitting, smiling at everybody, waving at everybody." And otherwise, I think most of the people who disagreed with me just ignored me, which might not always be the best tactic.
Well, this is part of the reason why I keep going to school. I have a pretty big toolkit, and I'm not I'm not averse to pulling out different things. But part of this circles back to the first question. I listen a lot, and I like to hear what people are passionate about, what they care about. Peterson Toscano talks about some of the work he's done, and he begins the discussion sometimes with people about their pets and what's happening to their pets with climate change. And so, you know, instead of saying what my beliefs are, I like to hear what other people are passionate about. And then I try to figure out how can I support what they're doing? How can I learn from them? You know, what solutions how are they coping? The hardest thing for me, though, is when I run across people who despair and who seem to be overwhelmed and say, you know, who are ready to throw up your hands. And I'm reminded of something Eileen Flanagan said once, that there is no faith tradition that says despair. So you kind of, it's like in this service, we haven't been promised that we will succeed. And part of the thing that keeps me coming back to Quakers is our boldness. That this small group of people, we believe that we can make a difference. And if not, we're trying.
Can I say something else about, on the topic of disagreeing about climate change? If you look at the polling, the number of people who believe that humans are primarily causing climate change is split something like 55-45. And it's been there pretty steadily for the past 10 years, and it hasn't moved much. But what has been moving is among the 55% who know that we're causing it, how much of a priority is climate change? And that has been skyrocketing in recent years. And just for the first time, you're seeing among millennial voters, when you ask what are your most important priorities in legislation right now, it's healthcare and climate change. And climate change is up there first or second. And that is something that we haven't seen before in any meaningful demographic. And I think the key to succeeding on climate is not necessarily convincing all of the 45%. Because one, I think to some degree, there's people who you will never convince. And you have to reckon with that truth and create a theory for success that grapples with that truth. And I think that includes taking the 55% that we have and making them as engaged, as active, and as sort of prioritizing this as much as possible ahead of everything.
Thank you all. So we have a lot of time for questions and discussion. So I think we can take questions both in person from the audience, and also people can type them into the chat box via Zoom, and Sarah can share some of those with us. And we do, if you're in the room, make sure that Milo gives you the mic before you start talking, so people who are live streaming can hear. So maybe we'll start with a question from in the room, and then we can go to one online. So curious what questions you all have.
No relation to Kallan.
No, none at all.
So this question is predominantly to Jaime, but of course I'd like to be happy to introduce the rest of what you have to say too. Jaime, you said at the very beginning that when you're talking about climate change, people say, you can't say the seas are going to be boiling. You can't tell people these things because people don't want to hear it and they're going to shut you out. But I have been very impressed at the response of the global community to Greta Thunberg, who actually speaks very plainly and very openly. And we were recently at a Climate Change 101 talk where they gave all the bad news about climate change, and then they got to the hopeful message about don't accept straws and compost and recycle, consider an EV. And I had to stand up afterward because honestly, I think those things can be very reassuring to people, but I think we're past the point of reassurance. If someone has lung cancer, you're not going to get anywhere by telling them that, oh, you have a breathing issue. You have to, sometimes you have to tell.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the example of Greta is really compelling. And to some degree, like the Green New Deal, it got as much as it has as much success as it has, in part because it's young people saying, Can you hear me okay? The Green New Deal and Greta have both, you're right, been successful in part because the messaging has been, this is where it is, this is where the science is, deal with it. And maybe you're right, like maybe to some degree, especially after the IPCC coming out, like we've had International Panel on Climate Change reports before, but none has given us a timeline with as specific numbers. And, you know, I thought it would be in the press for a week, maybe a month, and it would blow over the way that all these reports sort of blow over. They make headlines and then they go back in the drawer. But this one really feels like it's stuck in the consciousness in a way that has never happened before. Like, this is the deadline. This is how quickly we need to get places. And maybe that is starting to shift things. I do think that all messaging should be tailored to the audience. And there are certain audiences when you're speaking to whom, if you open with, if we fail to do what needs to be done, then our society may collapse and life on Earth in the long term may be failed. I think that people can sort of tense up and lock up, and I think there's, in psychology, they call it the like just world mindset or something. I think I got that term wrong, but it's something like people have a bias to believe that things are inherently good and that people are good and that like people have it worked out, and to believe that like it's chaos and no one is in charge and no one knows what they're doing. Speaks not just to this issue, but like the global state of the world in a way that people have not accepted in their lives and is a big emotional leap to accept. And before someone makes that big emotional leap to accept that society, as we know it, is not governed by ration, but by greed, you're going to put up a bunch of walls before accepting that. And I think it can be a barrier. And the other exciting thing is that while only 55% of Americans believe that humans are causing climate change, 80% of Americans support the solutions. If you poll and say, do you think we should have more wind and solar? 80% will agree with you. And to some degree, if you had to choose, would you rather have people agree with what the problem is or agree with what the solutions are to the problem? I'd rather have people agree with the solutions, which is why we ran the Clean Energy Jobs Act campaign. It wasn't the climate change campaign because you just put forward the solutions, which everyone supports, and they're overwhelmingly popular. And then, that's my thought.
Do either of the other panelists want to respond to that as well?
I'll add a little. Just sort of building on that and talking about the toolkit. You know, I've used playback theater to sort of present, have people tell their stories. And if you're not familiar with playback theater, it's a form of improv where the audience tells stories and then the troupe plays back the story. So we've done theater around, you know, the environment or people's concerns. Also, I have to put this in because of COP25, the climate change theater action, and if you just Google climate change theater action, they've just announced their call for collaborators. And every 2 years between mid-September and mid-December, playwrights from around the world provide these one-act plays, and people, you can it's like 50 plays, and you can download them and have readings in your living room or elaborate productions or whatever. And so that's part of it, you know, getting the discussion started, listening to people, and also I just love, you know, presenting the solutions.
That sounds really exciting. I just wrote it down so I can look it up too.
Yes.
Do we have questions from people online?
If any of our Zoom attenders have a question, you can unmute yourself at the bottom of your screen, or you can also use the chat and Q&A function.
I have a question.
Great. Please introduce yourself and ask away.
Okay. My question is Bob Schultz. I'm associated with FCNL. I live in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and I have a very specific question for Kallan. I got quite excited when I heard about Fridays for Future. But the question that has lingered in my mind is, where is that going? Is this something that we expect to happen every Friday for some participants? Or is this just a kind of a firecracker that exploded and we're not really sure about the fallout or the durability of it? I'd love to hear about that.
Well, it kind of depends on your geographic location. Okay, that's better. It kind of depends on where you are. In the US, so there's two types of strikes. You have deep strikes, and then you have weekly strikes. So in Europe, the weekly strikes have been very successful. Belgium has had tens of thousands of kids every Friday. So has Germany and the UK. Here in the US, a deep strike is when there's a lot of momentum to have everyone strike on one day. So March 15th was a deep strike. The next deep strike is May 3rd, though that's just a North American deep strike. The next global strike is April 23rd, I believe. Those have been much more successful in the US. We had 200 kids in Annapolis. There were a couple of thousand in DC and a couple of thousand in New York. So I think it's going to continue. I think the momentum is there. It might take a little bit longer to build in the US than it has in Europe and some of the other countries, but I think it's going to continue, and I think ultimately we'll have something.
Where can we follow that, Kallan?
Well, I run the Fridays for the Future USA Twitter account, so you can go follow them. But Fridays for Future has a website. They also have social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever you use.
Thank you.
Are there other questions from the online audience?
We have a question from Jeff. And he asks, when you talk about percentages, who do or do not believe in climate change? How does that break down generationally? Do you know?
So I don't have exact figures, but my anecdotal evidence is that the younger generations are much more accepting of climate science. I think we're also seeing that play out in terms of the members of Congress that I work with here in DC. So the younger members of Congress that are newly elected from both political parties are much more likely to accept the science and want to work on solutions to reduce emissions. I think especially with some of the younger Republicans, you're seeing the most active leadership on climate change from them. So part of this is that they're younger and just have been taught the science and understand it and have never really questioned it. I think the other component there is that they don't have a history of voting against climate action for years or decades even. We found that it's a lot harder for a legislator who has been voting for 30 years against climate change or against science to change their stance. It's just really hard. And so if you can catch legislators early while they're newly elected, that's a great time to help them build a record. And I think we've talked to some former members of Congress who have also told us that once you kind of vote consistently on an issue a couple of times, it's really difficult for you to change your vote. So that's my congressional anecdote, but would love to hear what you think.
Again, I do not have statistics. Don't have any numbers, but I think the difference is that, especially my generation, but also to some degree, the generation before me, we don't have a choice. This is our future. This is what's going to be happening to our world.
And I'll just say that if you're interested in questions like this, you should definitely check out the Yale Center for Climate Communication. They are a hub of some of the best climate polling and data about opinions in America about climate change. I think they're the best.
Beverly, do you have anything to add to that question?
No, I was just looking at something that was in the Q&A box. Well, I do have something to add, so I'm adding it. But it's regional also, and so it's not just generational. There are certain parts of the country that you can track that you get more deniers, and I think a lot of that has to do with fear, not so much with just absolutely denying the science, but just fear and being overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's a great point. In the Chesapeake Bay, there's an island called Tangier Island. It's already being affected by sea level rise. And I went to the island last summer, and it's a very Republican island, very conservative. And you go, and they don't talk about climate change. Climate change doesn't exist. It's erosion. So you kind of, there is definitely, that's kind of an extreme case of a very isolated community, but it is geographical as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other questions from people in the audience, in the room?
Hello, my name is Sam. Something I've been thinking a lot about is whether it is most meaningful to take action or become involved in issues pertaining to climate change at sort of a local community level or at a higher level. I personally find it very hard to kind of conceptualize the national, global level of politics and feel more comfortable at the local level. But I wanted to know what you all think about, is there room for people to act at both levels? Is there a way to connect what's happening, say, in a city, a county, a state, to what's happening globally? What are sort of your senses of those kinds of differences or chances to connect work that happens locally to work that has to happen at a more macro level?
Well, I work at the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is an organization laser focused on passing national legislation. But then my job is to work on state level legislation. So I'm outside the laser of the focus. But I firmly believe that we will not stay below a 2 degrees global temperature rise, and certainly not below 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise without bold national climate legislation. As someone who wakes up every day thinking and stressing about state bills, I understand that those are important victories, but they are not in and of themselves going to be sufficient to bend the curve the degree to which we want. They do bend the curve, and US emissions, with the exception of last year, have been going down without federal action. But if you look at the graphs, there's like steep S's. But I do think that Congress doesn't lead. Congress is the last entity in the nation to get the message about what's going on, because it is kind of the lowest common denominator. So sort of by definition, it can't get ahead of the curve. It has to be in the middle of the curve. And in order for Congress to be in the middle of the curve, you need states and local jurisdictions that are ahead of it on the curve and that are bringing the center of the curve along. So my short answer is that I do think there's a lot of room for interplay in both levels. and that while we need national legislation in order to win, we can't get national legislation without first building the momentum from the bottom up.
Yeah, I definitely think there's room to work at all levels. I mean, when you're passing a bill at the state level or a local level, a lot of times people are saying, well, the county should be passing resolutions. So, and with Fridays for the Future, it's a very global movement. It's a movement that has kids all over the world. But on the same time, and you do have these things, we do have guidelines where it's, well, we want to listen to the science and we want to pay attention to the Paris Accord, and we would like people to listen to the IPCC report. But we're still telling local strikers, if you're going to be striking at your local community, you have to decide what's best for your local community.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Emily mentioned that I'm an anthropologist. I'm an applied anthropologist, and so we claim everything. But so I think messy. But I just heard today that some of the funding that was cut for Central America had to do with helping farmers as a result of changes in agriculture due to climate change. So, this is causing people to leave Central America to try to come here. And, if you look at what's going on in the West Bank, which is going to be uninhabitable. And so wherever, that piece of if someone's passionate about immigration locally, there's that piece tied to it. And so we have to, we can help people make these connections where our local decisions are impacting everyone. And that's part of what I've learned from working on water issues. It's just water is transboundary, and so it touches everything. And I also work with the American Friends Service Committee, who's having their corporation meeting this week, and which is why I mentioned their work is working on immigration. Part of their work is immigration, and we know that people are already being displaced. And so what will be our policies, and our local policies around receiving communities? And I'm very much concerned about that living in Florida, because where will I go?
I'll just also add, I think every person kind of feels comfortable in a different space. So for some, you feel more drawn to local action or state level action. For some, it's federal or international. And same with tactics. I think we all resonate more with a particular way of approaching our climate work. So maybe it's organizing, or maybe it's doing policy work or advocacy or direct action or writing. I think there's so many different ways that we can address these issues, and they're all so important, and they all work together really well. I think the cool thing about lobbying, and I mean this lobbying at the federal level, but also the state or local level, it's a chance for you to share your personal story and your personal connection to the issue. So that can be a really great amplification of whatever your other work is in this space. So maybe you're working on a very local project to bring solar panels to your community center, right? That's a really awesome local action that makes a difference and adds up. And then if you get the opportunity to lobby and to tell your state legislator or your council member or your senator about that story and action, that is a way to kind of doubly count almost that action. So I guess I'd encourage everyone to figure out what makes you most passionate and gives you the most hope and brings you joy in taking that action, and then figure out ways that you can share that in other spaces, even if you really have one main focus, and then kind of dabble in other areas. I think everything is just really needed.
We have a question on Zoom from Louise. Louise, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
I have a very unstable connection.
Oh, we can hear you. Go
Again,
ahead.
okay. Well, I just want to, the work that people are doing are just really excellent. It's very exciting. But one of the most encouraging and optimistic changes that I've come across is the alteration of our farming practices that increase soil carbon. And at the same time, it also prevents soil erosion and increase percolation of the rain in terms of erosion and stuff. So it ties in with water as well. And these practices are will also be very profitable for farmers. So I'm just wondering who else is working on this in terms of policies or supporting farmers to make these changes, et cetera.
Beverly, do you have any ideas?
Yes, I do. And that is part of the UN working group with Quaker Earthcare Witness. We are looking at food sovereignty, especially with a lot of the communities that are already experiencing climate degradation. So Louise, I thank you for that. It is very encouraging, some of the solutions that are out there, and that's all more of the reason why I'm just really excited about some things that are going on, like just around the world, and being in touch with with some of the solutions that people are coming up with, and some of the just even within the states that don't rise up to make the local news, but people are working it out.
And I'll add, there's a lot of great organizations here in DC and across the country doing research and work in that space. So the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition is just one. And I think what we've seen in Congress is that talking about agriculture as a way to address climate change, thinking about soil sequestration and kind of regenerative agriculture practices actually have some bipartisan support. And I think, last Congress, I had some very interesting conversations with both Republican and Democrats on the Agriculture Committee. And they were reauthorizing the Farm Bill. And I think there was some interest in actually figuring out how to give more money to some of these programs that are part of the conservation piece of the Farm Bill. And then, as you might remember, that things got pretty heated and contentious talking about the nutrition title and food stamps. And so that tended to be where most of the energy and conversation went. But I think there is a lot of room to think about kind of how soil can sequester carbon, and it's going to be a huge component of the solution.
One interesting point that I think this hits on is that the best policies don't always make the best politics. I read this really, really interesting article recently that was a long article, well researched, well done, and it said that climate change has a bad problem, and BAD was an acronym which stood for boring as dirt. And the author sort of said that this such and such person came out and said, we need to care about climate change, and our solution is going to be soil sequestration. And the author was like, he came out and he talked about dirt. And I think that soil sequestration is where there's a lot of bipartisan support, like farmers who are largely Republican really care about this. Affects rural districts, saves money, saves runoff, saves water, saves carbon. But you have to stand up there at the podium and talk about dirt. And it's much easier to talk about a universal jobs program, which is not necessarily a better climate policy, but does make a better politics policy. So I just wanted to mention that on this topic.
Are there other questions online or in the room? I have one if no one else does. So we've talked a lot about sort of like larger scale actions or solutions. And I'm curious if each of the panelists could talk a little bit about some of the personal lifestyle choices that you make, and maybe small or large ways that you might share with the audience. I think if people are curious kind of what else they can be doing in their daily lives that will make a difference when it adds up.
Don't do that. Okay. Well, I get a lot of ideas from visiting the monthly meetings. One of the big things that I've been working on this week is I'm building a spiral herb garden. It only takes like a plot of about 6 by 6 feet. And if you, again, look at YouTube, there's lots of videos out there, but we're using bottles to build the walls. And so what the experiment with that is to get sort of a passive watering system just from the condensation. So that's my passion right now, my personal passion. In addition to, I have a couple of bamboo straws that I take with me everywhere. And I take my own napkins. I could go on, but I'm also a big train buff too.
Well, one thing we've decided, my family and I, is not to fly, which when you talk about not flying, there can be some really heated discussions. People really don't like it. I remember my mom replied to, there was a thread on an email once and someone said, well, sure, not flying for work, that's fine, but I'm about to retire. I want my vacations. And I have a friend that has completely internalized the fact that no, cars, driving someplace is worse than taking an airplane. It completely internalized it, which is certainly true for some cars, but it really, it's not always. So that's a big thing. But what I always, this question comes up a lot, and what I always tell people is kind of my biggest thing is that I am constantly thinking about the issue. So when you, so yeah, you're taking forks and spoons with you, and you're going to the grocery store and thinking, well, I'm not going to buy those apples because they've been shipped halfway across the world. So you don't really think about these little decisions, but because you're constantly thinking about the issue, it just affects everything that you do.
When I first started becoming passionate about climate change, I think people are laughing because I have a story that I tell a lot. But I didn't ride in cars. And I refused to ride in cars for 2 years. I made occasional exceptions for like Thanksgiving and family events. But other than that, I wouldn't get in the car, even if it was already going. So many people were like, Jamie, the car's already going. Why won't you get in it? And I say, because I'm stubborn and I'm doing this. And that started to change my sophomore year in college when I started volunteering with the Asheville Beyond Coal campaign, which is a campaign that now I believe has secured the retirement of about 290 coal plants across the country, which is actually the majority of the coal plants across the country. It comes out to something like 1 coal plant for every 2 weeks that the campaign has been going on. And I started thinking to myself, like, wow, if all of these people who have been working full time on this campaign had just sort of hermited themselves and reduced their own carbon footprint as much as possible instead of organizing, and how many more coal plants would be operational today. And that campaign was actually successful. It got the Asheville coal plant to commit to retiring. And that was a profitable coal plant that closed due to community pressure. And I was awestruck. And I sort of said, well, I don't want to focus on not being part of the problem. I want to focus on being part of the solution. And I got back in the car. That said, I still think that I don't think that personal choices are going to bend the curve of emissions. But I do think that personal choices are important to live in integrity within one's life. And I think at the end of the day, you can ask about practicality and effectiveness, but you also sort of have to ask yourself of like, what sits well with me and what is true to myself and my values independent of what the rest of the world is going to do. I have flown one time in the past 8 years. And yeah, people get really mad when you're not willing to fly. But Amtrak is wonderful. You know, you get to see the country in a way that you can't from 10,000 feet. And I do have a metal straw that I sometimes forget, but I do sometimes remember. And yeah, I think we each have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to live with integrity? And the data shows that if someone is making a personal choice about the environment, they are more likely to take a political choice about the environment. So they also matter on that front.
Yeah, so we carry forks and spoons around, and one day during the strike, my mom brought these metal containers because we had to get lunch today, and we went to one of our favorite restaurants to get takeout, and she brought these containers because they're potatoes. They come in these little, the little things that they put French fries and those paper things. And Mom said, "Can you just put them in these containers? Don't do." And he was like, okay, we can do that. And Mom put the container, and he put the potatoes up. Those can't be. And he just squashed the paper into the, into the metal container. So even when you're constantly thinking about it and when you're bringing stuff, mistakes do happen. Things don't always work out perfectly. So you can't always sweat the small stuff.
So I'm wondering if we have any final questions before I make a few closing remarks.
I have a question for Emily. Emily, you've been on the Hill for a lot of years, having very intimate closed-door conversations with DC staffers and parties, offices in both parties. And there's this sort of all this talk of like, are we in a new era of climate with all the unprecedented coverage? Are the Republicans finally going to be taking a new stance? Or is that just hype with no meaning behind it? Or is it all happening behind the scenes and there's about to be a jailbreak? How do the conversations among staffers and members of Congress and the Republican Party today compare to when you first started?
It's a great question. So I first started at FCNL in 2013. And at that time, there were no Republicans in Congress that were willing to say the words climate change in a positive way. And we spent here at FCNL with people who are on the call right now and many of our Quakers around the country to try to build up basic acknowledgement from Republicans on climate change. And slowly but surely, we got that. And I like to talk about kind of two watershed moments. And so thinking about from 2013 to the end of last Congress, we went from having 0 Republicans in the House talking about climate change to 45 Republicans in the Climate Solutions Caucus and also Republicans in the Senate talking about climate impacts. And we had the first ever Republican-led price on carbon with Congressman Carlos Curbelo from Florida introducing his Market Choice Act, which put a price on carbon to fund infrastructure, low-income assistance, coastal adaptation, R&D. So it was really awesome to see that kind of change happen, although we definitely had a lot more work to do. And then there's been a whole nother kind of shift in just these past couple of months. And I credit this to a lot of things. One, the work that advocates around the country have been doing for years to lay that foundation. But two, with the introduction of the Green New Deal resolution, you're seeing this issue get elevated in a way that it never has before. All of a sudden, everyone in the media is talking about climate change, and members of Congress have a choice. They can either be for the principles that are in the Green New Deal resolution, or they have to come up with their own alternative. And so we're seeing Republicans bash the Green New Deal, but also say, but here's what I think we should do instead. And you're seeing leadership among Republicans in certain committees in Congress also framing their remarks no longer as denying the science, but saying, we're here, we accept the science, we want to reduce emissions, and then putting forward their own versions of a solution, which generally looks something like innovation, carbon capture, nuclear energy. And I think there's room for a very legitimate debate about whether or not those solutions are ambitious enough, are going to get us to where we need to go. But it's a notable shift that we're, for the vast majority, not debating the science, and we're able to debate solutions. I will say, I say this, and then there was a hearing, today and yesterday that Republicans are still denying climate change in Congress as well, but there's a split among committees. So committees like the Science Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee are having very productive conversations. So I am cautiously optimistic, and I think there's a notable change. And so I think it's up to us kind of as advocates around the country to figure out how we capitalize on that, how we thank our members of Congress for what they've said, and how to encourage them to do even more. Because I think there is this tension between what is needed to actually meaningfully address the problem and what is possible right now. And so I'm thinking a lot about our work as laying this foundation to make it possible to elevate the ambition of our policy. And I see we did get another question over an online participant.
It's from Margaret. Margaret, would you like to ask? We can unmute you.
My question is I'm struck by two things. One is focus on the 55%, and the other is work on solutions. And that's a powerful message of hope for me. Are the people who are among the 55% living in states that can swing the Senate, so that we can, in fact, expect that the Senate would be able and willing to pass climate legislation that would be meaningful enough to make a difference?
Thank you, Margaret. There was a poor connection, so I'll repeat your question. It's about the 55% of those who do believe in climate change, and whether or not those 55% living in the US have the possibility of swinging the Senate.
The short answer is I don't know. I was just looking at national poll numbers. But again, if you want to dive even deeper into state by state percentages and even sort of district by district, even state level district by district, you can go to the Yale climate. What is it? The Yale program on climate communications. Thank you, Milo. And there you'll find these awesome heat maps where you can look at lots of different questions like, do you believe humans are causing climate change, and what solutions do you prefer? And they break it out not only by state, but by congressional district, and then also by state district.
Okay, so we've been talking about a lot tonight, and I hope that you all can leave here feeling hopeful and energized that there's some really great work being done by friends around the country. And so I'm so grateful for our panelists for sharing their time with us, and also for everyone who's tuned in. So being FCNL, we of course have some good next steps for everyone. So if you feel inspired to do some congressional advocacy, we have a few ways you can plug in and take action. So if you are really feeling inspired to set up a meeting with your member of Congress or their staff in district or in your home state, we would love for you to do that. And our ask is to urge members of Congress to pass a bipartisan piece of legislation that prices carbon. And at this time, FCNL has not endorsed a particular bill, but we are having conversations with a variety of legislators to build support for the policy overall, and to try to figure out the types of use of revenue members of Congress would support. And so we have written principles around carbon pricing that we evaluate policy by. Those are on our website, but we have all the information. We have a congressional leave behind that you can give to offices if you go on a visit. So you can find all this information at fcnl.org/energy, or send me an email, or Milo an email. So that's one thing. If you don't feel quite up to getting a meeting with your member of Congress, we also have a template online for writing a letter to the editor in your local newspaper, that would urge your member of Congress to take kind of urgent bipartisan action on climate change. So in a follow-up email that's going to go out tomorrow, we will have links to both of these asks. And so we'd love for you all to get involved in that way if you feel led. I'll also do a quick plug that tomorrow at 12 o'clock noon, I'm going to be speaking on a webinar that's a federal climate policy update hosted by an interfaith working group that we are a part of. And so you can find information for that on our website and on our social media, or you can send me an email, emily@fcnl.org, if you want me to send you the registration link. But we're so grateful again for everyone for sharing your time with us. It was really inspiring. And so I just want to thank everyone, and maybe we can give a round of applause to our panelists, virtually or in person.
Thank you.
Yeah. And with that, we will close the event. Thanks, everyone.